losing them to the streets. So the other experience I had early on about writing about this thing about was my own son. My own son, Joaquin, my oldest son, who I was worried about losing to the streets. And he was a real paradox for me. Because all through elementary, middle school, he'd done well. He was an athlete, a musician, model student. Hit 10th grade and suddenly, everything changed. Started getting angry. Well, why is he angry? He's well bred. Had attitude. Grades went down. Trouble in school. He and his mom started getting into a lot of fights. I decided, you know what? We can't simply fight this. We've got to figure this out. So I started spending time with him. And the more time I spent, the more I started to realize what was happening. One of the things he explained, he said, "You think I'm doing bad?" He said, "I'm doing good. You should see my friends." And then I realized that all the kids he'd grown up with, all the kids on the block that he knew, were failing and dropping out of school. So he thought getting D's was looking good compared to them. What did that tell you? Peer effects, so powerful, aren't they? Shaping our kids and the way they think about themselves, and the way they think about school. And part of what we had to do is figure out how to get him some new friends. But the other thing I realized, and it was something I should have known, having grown up in New York City myself, was that even though he came from a safe and loving home, as soon as he left the house, he had to be prepared for the streets.
That's it, yeah.
And if he didn't know how to carry himself, if he didn't know what kind of face to put on, what would happen? He'd be victimized. Because the world treats him differently than it treats me, than it treats many of us. And I had to realize, yes, you know, to some degree, I understand that when you're out there, that maybe you do need that armor. But I also have to get to realize, you know, take the armor off when you get home. Now you're back with us again. Let down the guard. But I could not take the armor away because I understood that the threats were real. And we've got kids out there who are being victimized and have to contend with it on their own. I share that with you because I think that part of what we've got to do is we've got to draw on lots of knowledge, research, experience to figure out how to do this work more effectively. What troubles me in the way we're approaching our interventions, the development of schools, the development of programs, is that it's not only is it not research-based, it's often not even based on an understanding of who we're serving and what's going on in their lives and what's happening with them. And so who can we serve? The ones we're able to serve are the ones who are the best off. The ones who have those loving parents, the ones who have somebody out there looking for them, advocating on their behalf, but the ones who don't, they're slipping right through it. They're slipping right through it. Because we haven't built that immune system, that support system. And that's what the work really entails. It entails more than simply designing powerful schools that are great at instruction and curriculum. That's absolutely essential. But if we're not also creating schools with social supports that can provide the mentorship, the guidance, we will find that the neediest ones are the ones who end up slipping right through the cracks. So let me take a moment just to share some findings. We did a study. We completed it in 2009 on single-sex schools. 7 schools throughout the country. We wanted to understand what can we learn from this experience. Does it make sense to separate young men of color? Is this an intervention that works? Because what we saw happening was these schools were proliferating. Again, without any research or guidance or standards, they were just growing. We thought maybe we better study what's happening and try to learn from it. So we started looking at them and trying to understand, do they work? How do they serve? And particularly, how do they compare to co-ed schools? Is there a magic in separating them? Because that was the logic behind it. Somehow we had to separate them to save them. We did interviews, we went to classrooms, we talked to parents, we looked at data of all these schools over a 3-year period. We also looked at comparison schools, similar schools, same neighborhoods that were co-ed. We looked at a variety of types of schools, traditional schools, private schools, choice schools, non-choice, charter schools. And we spent a lot of time talking to the young men in these schools, all to try to understand this question. What is there about being a black Latino male that results in greater risk? And what we found was that, first of all, there was clearly no benefit just from being separated. In fact, many of the schools that we were in, the school was ostensibly celibate, but they were often in schools where there were girls all around in the same building. So it wasn't as though they were that separate. Even the classrooms were separated by sex. But to the degree that, and some of the schools that outperformed them were co-ed schools. I'm talking about where boys of color were outperforming the boys in the single-sex schools. So, but we also found that what was key in the schools that were getting good results was not necessarily the separation, but what you would have suspected to begin with. Good teaching. Good teaching, strong leadership, a coherent plan, and all the things. And that's why when we did the standards for Kochbach, we said, if you look at the standards for Kochbach, they look like standards for what you would expect for almost any exceptional school. Because that's what boys need. They need the same thing everybody else needs.
Right.
What we found is that many of them, the rationale was that we're going to separate the boys because the girls are considered distracted. And we realized that sometimes the boys would even say that to us. But I'll also get you to think about this. Michael Kimmel, sociologist, historian books, has long found masculinity is performed by men for men.
Right.
By men for men. That is, just because you create an all-male environment doesn't mean the acting out, the performance goes away. Still there. In fact, sometimes some of these schools become hyper-masculine.
Right.
Where kids who are not as macho, kids who are unsure about their sexual identity or are sure and realize they might be gay, are not safe. And what we found is that in many of these schools, if the adults were not attentive to the kind of environment they were creating, that they would actually become environments where bullying could occur and could fester. And one of our strongest findings ending up being that the key quality, the key attribute of success in the schools we found that were successful was safety. Safety. And I don't just mean physical safety. I mean emotional, psychological safety. One of the things we found was that in many of the schools, some of the best teachers were women. Wasn't necessarily there, so it wasn't as though you had to have a man, much less a black man, teaching black boys. Some of the schools had struggled finding them, but they found women who were great teaching these young men. And so there was no clear case that only one type of person could be successful with these young men. We found that many of the schools did not have a clear sense of what it meant to save the young men, what they needed to be saved from, or what they needed to do to ensure that they be saved, even just academically, with respect to teaching styles or curriculum choices. To give you an example, one of the schools, an elementary school, there was a widespread assumption in school that boys want to read sports. That's what will get them reading. Well, one of my graduate students decided she was going to actually study that. What she found was that when you give boys a chance to actually choose what they'll read, some boys like Nancy Drew. Boys have all kinds of interests. And they don't necessarily conform to our narrow sense of what it means to be a boy. Another one of my colleagues, Linda Hull, has been studying similar phenomena amongst, again, young men in early adolescence. She did an activity where she got these boys to choose and design their own superheroes. And use animation to develop their superheroes. What was interesting is that superheroes they created very often did not look like the Marvel comic superheroes. They weren't super macho men. Some of them had very odd and unusual powers. The ability to see through things, the ability to read people's minds, the ability to transport themselves great distances into different times in history. And what she started to realize is that when she talked to the young men about the superheroes they were choosing, it was because they had not yet brought into the very narrow stereotypes of what a man is supposed to be. I want you to think about that for a moment, because one of the things that we don't know enough about is what is there about masculinity that places so many young men at risk. Safety was important, and we also found that part of what was critical to creating a safe environment was creating an environment where they were engaged. And not just behaviorally engaged, but cognitively, emotionally, psychologically engaged. And why was that important? Because it was when all these other forms of engagement showed up that they felt connected to the adults who thought that the relationship was strong, that they were more willing to buy in, more willing to work, more willing to make the effort. And that in turn led to higher levels of achievement. We found that, contrary to a lot of assumptions, that there was incredible diversity among the boys. Racial and ethnic diversity. So many of the schools were designed to serve black males, and lo and behold, they found out there were a bunch of Latino males in the school. And some of those black males were African, and some of them from the Caribbean. And that race was actually a much more complex attribute than they had led to understand. Guess what? Not all black children have black parents. And so when you engage their parents, suddenly you realize, oh, you're dealing with a whole diverse array of care providers, and you really want to deal with the provider, not the racial group. And the complexity was a challenge for a lot of the schools, because they weren't ready for that level. The complexity the children brought to their lives. We found that a lot of the immigrant kids were both more willing to be engaged, but also more likely to be subjected to forms of bullying. Because they were still adapting and assimilating into a new environment. And we found that particularly with the middle school age students, that many were less likely or had more trouble getting engaged than their high school peers, in part because the schools were struggling with how to create middle schools that really met the needs of kids. And across the country, what are we finding? Middle schools. Huge problem. A lot of people don't realize the dropout problem is not a high school issue. It's a middle school issue. We're losing them in 8th grade. In many schools, there are no adults with any training at all on how to work with children at that stage of adolescence. We found that some of the schools had a clear strategy and a coherent strategy, but some of them didn't. And they were making up things as they went along. And that almost never works. Simply separating the boys is not a strategy. You actually have to have an academic plan. And the schools that had it were getting great outcomes, and the schools that didn't were not. So I want to share that with you because while I know there are many of you who are working on creating single-sex schools, and this is not at all to say I oppose the idea. I am already a fan of several of those. I'm a fan of Eagle Academy. I'm a fan of Urban Prep. I can name several single-sex schools around the country that are demonstrating through their outcomes that they know how to educate young people. But I can also name schools where that's not the case. And we have to be as skeptical in what we're doing, as willing to evaluate, look at the outcomes, and not settle for it simply because of good intentions. And I want you to be willing, even when it's your own colleagues that set up these schools, to be willing to answer tough questions. Now, I also want you to be willing to provide the support. If you're going to make the investment in creating a school, then also provide the school with a chance to be successful. If you know you're serving a high-need population, then start the school with a social worker. Make sure they have access to a school psychologist. Make sure there's going to be a partnership with a health clinic, because you know that some of the needs are not simply academic, they have to do with the other social and health needs that the children will bring. And if we ignore those needs, what we find is the kids who come from the most difficult circumstances will be the kids we lose. And many of you are communities where poverty is concentrated. And let's be clear, when we talk about poverty being concentrated, we're not just talking about people not having money. We're talking about crime, we're talking about substance abuse, we're talking about domestic violence, we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about an array of social problems that impact children and their well-being. We have to have a holistic vision of who it is we're serving. And we have to be willing to forge partnerships with the other agencies, because if you don't, you cannot expect your teachers to be psychologists. Right. They're not trained. That's true. Or social workers. So we need to figure out how to make sure our schools get the resources they need. So part of what we've also been doing is studying the schools where young men of color are succeeding right now. We did a study in New York City a few years ago trying to understand why it was that in a city with the rising graduation rates have been rising in New York slowly but steadily, over almost 2/3, which is an improvement. Not as much as Michael Bloomberg would like to claim, but it's still an improvement. I would acknowledge that. I'm still concerned about some of the credit recovery schemes going on, which I think result in some fraud, but I do think there's genuine improvement being made. But when you look at the results for Black and Latino males, particularly as it pertains to college readiness, less than 20%. Less than 20%. So why? What's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with what we're doing? Why is it that reforms that are benefiting other groups are not benefiting this group? So part of what we found is that the schools, because in the study, we found over 20 high schools with graduation rates over 90% in New York City. So well, what are these schools doing differently? So some of these were single-sex schools, but some of them were co-ed schools. I wrote about this in an article for 5 Capital if you want to look closer at this. So well, what are these schools? Well, most of them all have a culture that's responsive to student needs. That is, teachers who focus on evidence of learning and take responsibility for learning. It's outcome focused. It's actually focused on mastery. So they're not satisfied with getting kids to proficiency or to level 2. They want kids to really understand the material, that they can really write well, that they can really read well. Outcome focused. They have tight structure, and I heard about the group we just went to a little earlier at the workshop, talked about discipline. Many things that the presenters talked about, we find in these schools. And why is structure so important? Because our kids need clear expectations. They need to know how things work. They need accountability. They're asking for accountability. Sometimes I go to schools where the kids are running the school. The kids look at me like, you know what, we should not be running the school. I wish there was some responsibility else here, because we should not be running things. It's sad. It's sad. It makes me angry to go to school like that. Our kids are crying out for instruction. They're crying out for order. They're crying out for guidance. In the schools where that's being provided, they're also teaching them how to study, how to plan, how to take notes, how to be a student. It's made explicit. It's deliberate. It's not left for them to figure out. They show them what excellent work looks like. I would say in a good school, there should only be 3 grades. Excellence, adequacy, or do-over. Do-over. you don't know. You don't know. Because you know if you have D, if D is an option, there are kids that will aim for the D, aren't there? They will.
Yeah.
That's my goal, to get through, to pass. How many of us know kids right now who can say, all right, to chemistry, they don't know a damn bit of chemistry, but they pass. They pass. Because no one really set the standard, what they should be aiming for. These are schools that use discipline to build character. They focus on values, focus on ethics. Why is that so important? Because if you only focus on punishment, the kids who lose are the kids who've given up. The hardest kids to discipline are the kids who no longer care. Try it. Tell them, I'm going to suspend you. What do they say?
Okay.
I'm a failure. I'm already failed. Now what do you got? Nothing. I'm going to lock you up. That's the New York City style. Lock you up next. No. We actually have to find a way to get them to care again. To get them reconnected to learning. Or sometimes we have to go a step further about what's behind this problem. Suppose they're acting out because they're 16 and still can't read. Cannot read, so they're embarrassed. Every time reading comes up, they're embarrassed. Well, they need to see a reading specialist. Suppose they're acting out because their mom has cancer. And they're stressed out. They don't know what to do about it. Suppose they're acting out because they just lost their home. We need to know what we're dealing with. What are we dealing with here? Because a lot of our young men don't even know how to express what it is that's happening in their lives. Too much for them. So we need to know what is behind the problem and respond to it. We need to be willing to teach code switching. Lisa Delphi calls it teaching the codes of power. When is it time to pull up my pants? Why? How do I dress for that job interview? That's right. Why shouldn't I wear my hoodie? We can't expect them to know this all on their own, can we?
Right.
And yes, there's a time for the hoodie, and there's a time to sag, and there's a time for ebonics, and there's a time for standard English. And if you don't know when that time is, what you will find is young men with talent and potential and ability who gets opportunities denied to them. And they won't say, they usually don't say at least, I'm not going to give you the job because you look like a criminal. They won't say that. They just say, thank you for your application. But all of us know, because all of us have learned how to code switch, haven't we? Oh, yes, we have. So what does it take to teach our young men how to navigate the codes of power? This is not about denying who they are. This is not about denying their culture. It's about empowering them to make them bicultural, multicultural, bilingual. There's a time, but there's also a place. And to build these kinds of children who can code switch and navigate multiple worlds, it takes relationships. So that they know when we ask them to pull up their pants, it's not a put down. We're actually trying to help them. And so if it's not based on a strong, caring, loving relationship, chances are you will get the opposite. They'll show you some more. The schools that are making a difference are taking the time to teach code switch. And then also teaching them how to cope with the codes of the streets, which are different. They have deliberately challenged the stereotypes. Why? Why are they challenging the stereotypes? Because if you don't challenge the stereotypes, the stereotypes will undermine your children. They will lead your children to believe they have a better chance of being a hip-hop star or a ball player than a scientist or a writer. How do we get our kids to believe that they can be anything? When you hear Freeman Hrabowski tonight, you're going to meet a man who has created an environment where young people of color believe they can be scientists. Right. He's created a stereotype-free zone in higher ed. We need to do that in our schools. We need to do that in our schools, because if we don't do that, we will find that the stereotypes will undermine them. Read Claude Steele's work on stereotype threats, how they limit, confine, and prevent us. I was doing research down in Barbados, little Barbados. small Caribbean island with a higher adult literacy rate than the United States. When I was down there, I found out that the average SAT score for 300 students who had taken the SAT to apply to college in the United States was over 1,200. This is when 1,600 was the top score. All the kids who took the test were black. All of them were poor. What does Barbados have that we don't have? Well, when you talk to young people in Barbados and you ask them what you want to be when you grow up, you are very unlikely to hear ball player or rap star. They think they can be judges. They think they can be doctors and lawyers. And the only thing stopping them is the fact they don't have that many jobs in Barbados. They got to leave the island. But it's not their race that stops them. Right. We got to create schools where the kids don't believe that their racial identity will determine what they can be. These schools adopt rituals and practices that reinforce the core values. And you saw that today with Kamau demonstrating the work of Sankofa. Because what does that do? It reminds them why they are there, what this is about, who they are. Our kids need that sense. They need that sense of meaning. They need that sense of aspiration, of goals. They understand where they're going. They need to have their leadership developed so that they become part of our effort. We have to create schools where it's cool to be smart. What does that mean? It means the peer culture is totally aligned with the adult goals. Everybody's working for the same thing. How do you do that? How do you get that level of buy-in from your students? They're working for the same thing. They're willing. They're invested. Eagle's done such a great job of developing these kind of rituals. Talk to David about how they build a culture so that their peers are encouraging and challenging them to do what it takes to be successful. Keep in mind that school culture, as critical as it is, can never be imposed on school. You can't just dictate it. You can't just say, you will be a school that is positive. You will be a school that is caring. I wish you could. I wish you could. It requires buy-in. It requires genuine understanding, commitment. It requires everybody on the same page understanding how we do things, and not just how we do it, but why we do it. I had a brand new principal in New York City. She just came out of the Leadership Academy. Came to me, she said, you know, Pedro, every day my students have food fights. They're throwing food at each other, it's disgusting. I don't know what to do. I have a teacher at every table, they still throw food. So what can I do? I said, I can't believe this is happening. I took her to PS12. PS12 is just 3 blocks away. They never have food fights. And she sat, she watched, she even ate lunch with kids. She was found it so remarkable that these young people learned how to eat on their own in a civil manner. No one had to police them. They took their food to their trays on their own. And after she talked to the principal, Diamond Dixon, asked, how did you get your kids to do this? She said, well, it's part of our culture. It's part of our expectations. When they first come to school, we actually teach them how to eat lunch in the cafeteria. They don't leave anything up to chance. It's very deliberate. It's very focused. And guess what? The kids prefer that than to live in a school where they're throwing food at each other. Right. Who wants to be in a school like that? That's true. The schools that are making a difference in building partnerships with parents' community. They're thinking about mentors. And they're identifying who are the kids who are most at risk that need more support. A school like Mount Haven Prep. They decided any student coming in 9th grader who had a criminal record, they're guaranteed to get a mentor. You get a mentor right away because we know you need help. We're not going to wait till you get in trouble. And they assign a teacher and say, you got this one. You got this one. What does the mentor do? The mentor checks in every single day. No matter what happened. Did you go to class? Let me see the work. Every single day. Because they need to know that some adult has their back. Some adult is watching. Every child needs that. And we know that out there are some kids that don't have it. Don't have it. What do they also need? They need a sense of family. They need a sense of community. I sat there in Mount Haven Prep with a group of young men that were talking about gangs. Every single young man was in a gang. And we asked the question, why? Why are you in a gang? One young man said, I could not use a cell phone until I joined a gang. They would take it from me. He says, I'm a Crip now. No one takes my cell phone. A lot of us use our cell phones without worrying, right? I bet you if you were worried, you might think about getting some help too, wouldn't you?
That's it.
Our kids need to join something, need to be part of something. They need to be part of a community. Otherwise, they will seek it someplace else. And powerful schools create community, create a sense of family, a sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, because they need it. We need to engage their parents. The parents will either be your strongest ally or your biggest problem. One or the other. The schools that take the time to figure out how to work with parents, how to engage them, how to meet the needs, are more likely that parents will do their part to support their children. Now the truth is there are some kids out there in group homes, in foster homes, being raised by grandparents who don't have that family support. We got to make up for what they don't have. But the other ones, we've got to figure out a way to deal with that caregiver. And the vast majority, I can't tell you if I go to schools where they tell me, no, our parents don't care about our kids. The parents are the problem. And I so rarely meet parents who don't care about their kids. So rarely. I rarely meet parents say, you know, I'd like my child to be incarcerated one day. I'd like my child to be homeless. Or I'd like my child to live with me for the rest of my life. I meet too many parents like that. Most parents I know want their children to be successful. Doesn't mean they know how to help them be successful. Right. But they would prefer. We've got to figure out how to build that bridge, that partnership. And that's what the schools are doing. And they are hiring men of color in professional roles. In professional roles, not just as the dean of punishment.
Right. The dean of punishment, I love that.
Not just the phys ed teacher. Not just the security guard. The math teacher, the science teacher. Our kids need to see it. And it's not because only men of color can teach them, but they need to know that people like them can do all kinds of things.
That's right.
That's
all
right.
kinds of things. And they need to see it. A lot of them never see it. Lastly, and this is very important, because there's a whole debate out there about what it takes to educate our kids. And I'll be clear about this. I go to some schools that are so chaotic, that are so disorderly, and every time I go to a school like that, it makes me angry. And I will always opt for a school that has order and structure, even if it goes too far with the regimentation, over chaos. But I'll say this, the schools that rely on regimentation, the schools that are sweating the small stuff, the no excuses schools, will never get our kids to be achieving at the highest level. Never. I'll tell you why, and we're seeing it right now. Because the schools that are actually preparing our kids to succeed at the highest level are not afraid of independent thinkers.
Right.
They're not afraid of kids who can actually go to the bathroom on their own. Who can talk in the hallways. I was talking to John King, the State Commissioner of New York, when he was a commissioner, or the head of school at Roxbury Prep, a fine charter school. And I noticed there was no talk in the hallways. I said, you know, I'd never been to an independent private school where kids can't talk in the hallways. He said, well, we found this works for these kids. So my question is, are these kids being prepared to be leaders?
No.
Because leaders get to talk in the hallways.
That's it. It's real.
Let's cultivate the agency. Let's cultivate leadership. Let's give them a sense of history and culture, a sense of responsibility, so they don't have to be policed.
Yeah, that's
Let's
real.
give them a chance to channel that energy, not to crush it. Not to crush it. I was at Excellence Charter School for Boys in Bed-Stuy. Wonderful school. In the kindergarten classroom, at one point the kids are reading, and then the teacher says, okay, break. He says, now it's time to act like animals. And one kid lets out a roar. Ah! The other kid gets on the ground, he's acting like a snake. He says, what's going on? He says, it's animal time. We're going to use that on animals. They can do whatever animal they want. They do this about 10 minutes, then we're back to reading.
That's it. Teach them how to self-regulate and all of that.
He
It's
wants
like,
to
that's
let
deep.
that energy out. He knows the 5-year-old.
That's
And the
it.
play's got to be part of their learning.
That's it.
And you know what they do and excellence to teach concentration, every child learns to play violin.
Yeah.
And when you see these kids play violin, what do they teach them? Teach them to learn how they breathe it.
Posture.
Posture. Concentration. You know what the research on ADHD is showing us? That if you actually use things like chess and music, you can actually have to medicate. You can help kids learn to concentrate and self-regulate on their own.
Yeah, that's it.
So, I don't make it sound as simple, but all of these things are important to our kids. A holistic education.
Yes.
An integrated education that focuses on the social intelligence, the emotional intelligence, cognitive ability, physical ability, all of that is important to well-being. So let me close with this. I was just, Ron, I want to make sure there's time for questions. I was, live in Washington Heights. Washington Heights is home to the largest Dominican community in the United States outside of the capital, Dominican Republic. I was going 6 a.m., stopped at McDonald's to go get a cup of coffee. I was headed up to Westchester to go speak at a school. And I get in there, and this guy, he has a look like someone who's been up all night. You know that look? And he's been on the street. He's high, and he's tired, and he's haranguing a customer for $1. And he's on and on and on. The guy is like ignoring him. He's trying to get his stuff and get out. So he sees he's not getting any money, and he turns to look at me. He stares me up and down. He looks at me for a while. He says, "You OG, ain't you?" OG, I said, "Why you say that?" He said, "I can see the scars." He said, "Scars?" He said, "Anybody with that many scars must be OG." I said, "That's right, I'm OG." He says, "What you do?" I said, "You got a suit on." I said, "I'm a professor." He said, "Professor? Professor, you live up here?" I said, "Yeah, I live right up past where I was born." He said, "You were born up here and you're a professor?" I can't believe it. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to talk to some teachers." He said, "Teachers?" I said, "Teachers?" I'm getting angry. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I hate teachers." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because they didn't believe in me." That's right. They didn't believe in me. If they had believed in me, I wouldn't be out here in the streets now.
Yeah.
He said, "You tell those teachers out there that there are people like me that they're now afraid of, that they had a chance to put in a different direction.
That's
They
real.
better use that chance now. Otherwise,
Teach, doctor.
That's real. That's
they
real.
be $1 for some breakfast." We
That's
do have
real.
a choice here. We really are concerned about saving lives and saving young men. The work we're doing is absolutely critical. It is work of a higher quality. I have to say that some people are not really cut out for this work.
Amen.
That's real.
They don't really
That's real.
understand
The
what's
work required.
That's
It has to come from the
real.
heart, doesn't it?
That's real. That is
So
real.
those schools and
It's a
teachers
calling.
make a difference. They're not about a job. They're about something else.
That's
They're
real.
about doing something else.
That is real.
I want to thank all of you for the commitment that you bring, and let's take some questions now.
That is